Welcome to The Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. As always, you are with Mike
and Ian
as we read through the Aubrey Maturin canon of our favorite author, Patrick O'Brien. Ian, we are smack in the middle of HMS Surprise and about to engage in a huge chapter here. Can you tell us what we just left and what we have coming up?
Mike, with pleasure. Last week, we had heard how Stephen was pushing himself to heal faster from his injuries. Jack had inspected the crew of the Surprise and discovered scurvy aboard. Lieutenant Nichols had rowed Stephen to St. Paul's Rocks and confessed to trouble in his marriage, only for a huge storm to come along, washing Nichols and the boat and the Surprise away, leaving Stephen Maturin stranded on the rocks with no water. This time, Babbington comes to the rescue. There's going to be solar healing. There's going to be badger bag, surprising sickness. There are purloined rats, midshipmen's confessions, vampires, one of the canon's favorite creatures, not to mention French poetry, hurt feelings, thoughts on marriage, and albatrosses. Mike, there's more symbolism than you can pack into the average novel in even just one half of one chapter here with this O'Brien stuff.
It is so true, Ian. I am just so loving being back here on HMS Surprise and thinking, oh, yes. This is like me falling in love again all over in my youth. You know, thinking back. I just love this. Well, as you say, Ian, it's Babbington and the barge's crew after a long pull into the wind who finally rescues Stephen from St. Paul's Rocks. They give him a canteen and he drinks, irrigating his blackened mouth and cracking throat, filling his wizened body. So this guy is not doing well. No. He drinks large volumes with enormous pleasure. And Stephen and O'Brien both, always great descriptors. A sharper pleasure than love, more immediate, intense. I thought, boy, that's good water. I'm surprised Coke didn't use that on the Dasani label there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Well, he's got all his sample boxes. Stephen is still Stephen. You know, he may be half dead, but he's got his sample boxes and rocks that he's ready to have them taken back to the Surprise, which lies about 15 miles away, still badly battered from the storm. We hear the story of the storm secondhand. Men lost overboard, sails blown clean away, the Surprise laid over on her side and guns breaking loose. The captain coming on deck, saving the ship from this and also a second squall. So the ship is now beaten up with a jury rig, but at least there's plenty of rainwater to drink. Yeah, we're not short on water anymore. And it seemed, Ian, that, that wasn't the only thing on Jack's mind.
Well, we get it told to us by Bonden that Jack seemed to be really strongly driven, not only by the need to recover and preserve the Surprise from this terrible storm, but also clearly his desire to save his friend. And of course, saving his friend who Jack had risked life, limb, and reputation for to save from the hands of the French only a few chapters before. So Bonden, with great understatement, tells Stephen that the captain had been quite upset. Okay, that's one way of putting it.
Yeah.
So we quickly fast forward to the barge finding its way with Stephen all the way back to a rendezvous with the Surprise. So there's pleasure for Jack as Stephen comes aboard. Stephen apparently transformed from a convalescent to an almost able-bodied seaman of a kind by, or as a result of, his time on the rocks on the island there. There's also, beside the pleasure, there's been some anxiety for Lieutenant Nichols. It seems like, as Stephen gives the account of Nichols' disappearance, Jack knows or suspects that there must be more to the story, and he wants to honor the dead man, but he is rather kind of downbeat, and he just says, he was a very good officer, which is a nice compliment, but I think Jack's really not sure what to make of the Nichols story. Now, everyone, including Pullings, seems to think that Stephen should go below for more rest and recovery. But Stephen, his transformation comes in his mood as well. He's insistent that he's in great shape, even though he looks a bit cadaverous. The text says he is wizened, wrinkled in his loose, blackened skin. So nobody's idea of a Greek hero.
No, no, not even a little bit. Now, many things have changed, but what hasn't changed is the uneasy relationships between the surprises, the envoys party, especially Atkins, who wants Stephen to cover up his nakedness when he comes on board, but gets, as Poling says, one in the eye from a high-spirited Stephen. Stephen replies, "You're very officious, sir, but this is the garment in which I shall appear before God. I find it answers pretty well. It may be termed my birthday suit." And Poling says to Babbington, in addition to that, "Now that's choked the bugger off." So I'm loving this. We're getting, very quickly these little snippets about Atkins here.
Absolutely. And jokes. I mean, proper jokes. That's a solid 7.5 out of 10 on the joke scale for the birthday suit.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Oh.
over to you.
Well, we've got Stephen and this idea of being transformed in the storm and then the heat. And Stephen actually tells Jack if it hadn't been for poor, unhappy Nichols, he would have been glad to have been marooned. He was roasted, but that's done extraordinary things to his sinews. He feels no pain, no awkwardness. He says, "I can now dance an elegant jig." Later, he flexes his injured hand, now largely healed, and comes all over mystical. He says, "Bless the sun in his power."
Ooh. Stephen's becoming a bit pagan here. Now, I don't know if I'm the only one. I follow this thing of Stephen being transformed by heat, and it does seem a bit mystical. And I'm vaguely aware that if you follow the kind of online fandom of O'Brien fans, this gets a fair amount of disbelief. Not quite as much as the bear suit in Post Captain, but Stephen's supernatural transformation gets a bit of disbelief. And I think that's okay. Just because he's written super fact-based, authentic historical context for other parts of the book, I think he's allowed to use a bit of magical realism here. And this to my non-expert eye looks like a bit of magical realism. Gabriel Garcia Marquez had already, started writing his stuff when O'Brien was in this stage of his career. And magical realism seems to be all about, symbols and new perspectives, looking at life, looking at events and relationships in new ways, in fantastical ways. And that seems to be what O'Brien's doing here. What do you think?
Well, he does quote the Bible a lot, so he comes from a long tradition. Sorry. But
oh, may you be forgiven.
oh no, right. And actually, what I'm thinking is a scene that'll come up in the second part of this chapter. Thinking,
Yeah.
you know what, this magical realism isn't a whole lot different from, as you say, Ian, the symbols and the meaning. And I can't remember what the novel was that I read years ago, but the author's intro said, "The following novel is true, even if it never really happened." And I thought, that's what so much of this is. It's true, whether it ever actually happened or not. But I think that O'Brien almost was prescient in terms of thinking about these comments. So he does have Stephen whip out his lancet at one point and do a little operation on his hand too. So it's like, okay, if you can't believe the sun, it must have been Stephen's little lancet operation that fixed that hand so well.
Oh, you believe that if you want to. That's good.
That's right.
Jack, for his part, can easily see that Stephen is much better and probably eventually wishes that he hadn't asked the next question, which was to ask Stephen, what did you drink when you were marooned on the rock? And Stephen, who's never one for kind of applying a filter, says, "Boiled shit." And even repeats the phrase just to get more blushes and more awkwardness for Jack. And he goes on to explain that the only liquid on the island after the storm had passed was rainwater left in a hollow that the birds had defecated in. It became boiling hot. It got thicker day by day. When it was no longer liquid enough to drink, he had drunk the blood of boobies, these birds on the island, mixed with seawater and the expressed juice of kelp. And besides giving us a bit of revulsion, it seems to me, as we'll see later on, one of Stephen's jobs in this chapter maybe is to play on Jack's squeamishness a little bit by giving him all these terrible, disgusting ideas and images in his head. I'll just say, Jack, watch out for what's coming in the sick bay if you think this is yucky.
Right, right, right. Well, Stephen's back with the naval family, who have their own kind of weirdness, their own way of celebrating. It's time for the crossing the line ceremony. So there's so many things we picked up for the Lover's Hole from here, and crossing the line was certainly one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, this crossing the line ceremony, but this time it's pretty muted given the loss of their shipmates in the storm, given the loss of Nichols. Badger Bag does come aboard with his trident. He shaves the head of the lower deck crew, the members who are crossing the equator for the first time, and he taxes Dr. Matra and Mr. Stanhope and his party. And Ian, I was thinking, gosh, we know Badger Bag. We've heard about Badger Bag. And I thought, no, well, I'm not sure. No, I think this is his first appearance in the canon, because I'm thinking
Yeah.
back through that we crossed the line a number of times and we hear various and sundry references. But this Badger Bag, this is King Neptune's helper,
Right.
right? Is that,
Right.
in this sort of hazing, crossing the line ceremony? Is this?
Exactly. It's funny. It's one of these things that seems to be common in most navies. Most navies seem to have a version of it. Certainly the British Navy, certainly the American Navy, the French Navy. We have something that we can share on our socials about the crossing the line ceremony in the French Navy. Maybe the characters get different names, but in the sort of British naval tradition, Badger Bag, like you say, Mike, is King Neptune's helper, and anybody who hasn't yet crossed the line. I think they're called shellbacks. No, hang on.
Right, right.
You're a shellback
Yeah.
when you have crossed
Oh,
the
well, you
line.
have. You're right.
Right.
Oh, wait.
So to get transformed to being a shellback, you have to go through the hazing and the pretty disgusting, it has to be said, cleansing and vitrifying rituals of crossing the line. Lots of the world's navies, as we say, practice it. The Surprise and Jack and Stephen in our story so far have been in the Northern Hemisphere in Europe, so it's natural that we cross the line. So we have the ceremony. And this is a first for Stephen, but clearly not for Jack, who says, how did you like what he calls our Saturnalia, our kind of raucous celebration here? And Stephen is going to keep digging a little bit. He says, well, I'm in favor of innocent mirth, but I wonder why you suffered it when we have so much work to do. And Jack, not for the first and certainly not for the last time, says, this is about naval custom. The hands will work double tomorrow with a much better heart, since we've indulged them in this really hallowed naval custom. And Stephen keeps on needling. He says, the Navy, hag-ridden, he says, by custom and esoteric language. For example, he cites the selling of Nichols' clothes at the mast as an example, which I don't think is a particularly weird custom. I think it's quite pragmatic rather than being mired in superstition. But anyway, it does make us go and quickly check what is Saturnalia. The ancient Roman festival of Saturn was in December, which was a period of sort of merrymaking and the predecessor, in a lot of ways, to the Christian festival of Christmas. Also used as an occasion for wild revelry. So that's the comparison that Jack had in mind. So, Mike, we've got fun and hijinks and bizarre ceremonies on deck. What's going on below deck?
Well, it's interesting because after all this, and Stephen's thinking, oh, they're going to work doubly hard tomorrow. He says, well, Jack, I have far graver news. He's got news from the sickbay, and he says scurvy has returned. We remember we saw scurvy early in last chapter. He says now with all this that, they've been working so hard with what's been going on, it's returned, affecting many of the crew, not just the former raccoons. And the squall has, the storm the ship's been through has completely wrecked his sick bay. So it's here. He really had very little to treat it with to begin with. Now he has nothing. He says green vegetables, fresh meat, and citrus juice must be provided within a few days. And Stephen tries to make the case for an immediate stop in Brazil. But Jack wisely spots Stephen's other agenda, at least what he thinks Stephen's other agenda is, that is, pursuing scientific discoveries, which he lumps together under the heading of vampires. Say, whoa, this eastern part of Brazil sticking out, we could just stop right there. Yeah, that's the home of vampires, isn't it? And we heard that a little bit earlier in this chapter, Stephen asking about that. And Stephen admits that he longs to set foot upon the new world as quickly as possible. But he says, this goes beyond that. why don't you come to the sick berth and see what we're dealing with here?
Right. So this is a moment for Jack to reflect a little bit, and we get inside a little bit of his thinking. He needs to get down to the 40s, down to the South Atlantic quickly. He needs to get well south of the Cape of Good Hope, currently held by the Dutch, so he can't really touch and land and replenish there. He needs to get down there to catch the westerlies to take him into the Indian Ocean in time for the monsoon. He is expected, I think he's ordered to stop at Rio for resupply. So if he stops now and gets held up by these Portuguese officials, he's not only kind of outside of his orders, but he might also get held up on this kind of time window that he has for getting south and getting into the Indian Ocean. So he's weighing all this up in his mind as he's still clearly doubting Stephen's intentions with regard to vampires. But he does come to the sick bay. First, though, on the way, we get another little episode to do with healthcare here. Stephen says, somebody's taken my rats. He went to see them and found the undamaged cage door open. So it wasn't the rats gnawing through and escaping. This was the hand of a human. And we've already had this with Stephen once, right? We had the asp in spirits of wine, and the spirits of wine were drunk by the crew of the Sophie, I think, in Master and Commander. He's very upset and says, well, is this another one of your naval customers? This theft, he says, has ruined the experiment. Now, we remember that he'd been fattening up these rats and doing other things to them besides. Never mind, he says, even though the thief ruined the experiment, McAllister and I will find the thief, since we'll be dissecting the entire crew if we don't deal right away with this scurvy. And he gives a hint about the madder and the red staining of the bones. He says the thief's bones will blush for shame. Which makes us wonder, is Stephen overstating the risk of scurvy? And we're going to find out pretty soon whether that's true or not.
This is another one of the squeamish scenes for Jack.
Exactly.
I just love it. And Stephen shows him around, and he shows him, amputations and wounds that are not healing and coming back and everything. But Jack isn't convinced that I really need to stop until Stephen shows him an entire box of teeth, and then reaches over and shows him how easily he can just pull patients' molars out with with his fingers and palpate their rotting gums. And Jack is, Jack is having none of it. He says he's satisfied. He kind of quickly ducks out, heads back to his quarters, tells Killy, I won't be having any dinner today, and calls for Mr. Babbington.
Well, you kind of wonder what's going on with Babbington then. Like, do we suspect that Babbington's going to help out with the scurvy? No. This is a slightly different agenda. We've got this nice kind of oscillating backwards and forwards in the chapter between grim news and good news. So as a counterpoint to the grimness in the sickbay, we've got a bit of what could be good news for Midshipman Babbington. He gets a summons to the captain's cabin. He's worried that he might be in for another round of sharp words from the captain. And we get this nice reference to a phrase that Babbington had been checked with by the captain just a little while ago. This ship is not a floating brothel, sir, had said Aubrey, and that's a note-perfect critique of Babbington's main personality flaw, as we found out in the past and as we're going to find out again. But it's not to be harangued again. It's actually good news for Babbington. He's sufficiently close to qualifying as a lieutenant that Jack has decided to appoint him as an acting lieutenant to replace Nichols. And in doing so, Jack gives very, very gracious compliments about his confidence in Babbington as a watchkeeping officer, so much so that Babbington, I think, has a little tearful moment, and his conscience pricks, and then he can't go on without confessing. Confess to what? Confessing that he, Babbington, had eaten some of the doctor's rats taken by somebody from the now empty cage. Now, Jack reminds Babbington of all the kinds of... Babbington, he of the two arms that might have been one arm only if it wasn't for the doctor. Jack reminds Babbington of all of this. Babbington bursts completely into tears, and we hear the story of the rats, or at least from the perspective of Babbington. He defends himself a little bit by saying he's basically always been on, as we would say it, Team Stephen. But even though he defended Stephen's reputation amongst people in the midshipman's berth, he had not been able to stop himself when offered a fat, freshly cooked rat served with onion sauce.
Right.
And Jack has an inkling of what's been going on with the rats. He says, well, if your conscience is troubling you, your digestion's going to be troubling you even more. And we get this really nice confession. Stephen is called in. Babbington says to Stephen, I ate your rat, sir. I am very sorry. And I ask your pardon. And then we get the equally funny, very deadpan, very dry response from Stephen, who either doesn't notice it or pretends not to notice it. Well, he says, I hope you enjoyed it. Listen, Jack, will you look at my list now? Jack says, well, hold on a minute. He only ate it when it was dead. And Stephen says, well, it would have been a strangely hasty, agitated meal had he ate it before. Cue laughter of everybody except perhaps Babbington.
Right. But then Stephen does get a moment of clarity vis-a-vis the experiment. He says, well, wait a minute, did you save any of the bones? And Babbington says, no, we're so hungry we crunch them up like lark bones. And Stephen gives a very deadpan, poor fellows, and declines to press charges. When Jack asks him, should I officially note this? He says, no, nature will take care of that. So, doesn't sound like good things ahead for Babbington and the midshipmen here. And it's not just nature. Stephen goes back to McAllister, who, he says, I need you to mix up a bolus for each of these culprits and a given time. He has to have them dismissed from their duties while this medicine takes effect. It's going to be pretty stringent stuff here.
Uh-oh. Not a good day to be a midshipman.
No. Right. Well, Jack decides not to go into a Portuguese port and lose time, but to stop at a fishing village in order to get the supplies to treat the scurvy. So, kind of a win-win here. Now, Stephen's the only Portuguese speaker, and he knows for sure what they need, so he has to go along. But Jack has him swear on his honor not to bring back any vampires. And while the party is ashore, Hervey complains that all of his midshipmen are constantly in the head, saying if they spend any more time in the head, they'll soon be spending their time at the masthead. So, bump. Thank you, Mr. Hervey, for your humor. Don't forget to tip your server. He'll be here all week. But I couldn't help but remember Jack's time at the masthead in The Surprise. Hopefully, we're still going to see his initials up here somewhere. He was up there so often. A nice flashback to Jack on The Surprise and the midshipmen's antics.
Right. And a little reminder that the first rule of the universe is midshipmen get no sympathy from anybody at any time.
Right.
Whatever has been going on. Now, as we're sort of paused off the shore of Brazil here, by the way, in my imagination, this is sort of analogous with the moment in the Master and Commander movie when they stop to gather intelligence and we witness the pretty girl in the canoe. That moment with all the beautiful kind of forest. Not the only moment in this chapter when we're going to have a reminder of the Peter Weir movie. We'll come to another one in a second. But back on the Surprise, Jack takes tea with Mr. Envoy Stanhope. And Jack is reminded of his aunt in the way that Stanhope pours tea with these very priestly gestures. And O'Brien gives us a really great quote here. Once he had established that Jack and Hervey were connected with families he knew, he treated them as human beings. All the others as dogs, but as good, quite intelligent dogs in a dog-loving community. So a great bit of characterization of the envoy. Jack sees him as a bit ineffectual and, as we said, a bit priestly, but he sort of likes that the envoy doesn't want to trouble anyone, that he's grateful for everything that's being done to accommodate him, and never complains about the consequences of the squall or about the wreckage on the ship. But perhaps rather differently from the attitude of Mr. Secretary Atkins. But we'll come to Atkins later. Meanwhile, the envoy asks why some of his naval acquaintances keep referring to the Surprise by a different name. They call it the Nemesis. And Jack gives him the story of the Surprise cutting out the mutinous Hermione from the Spanish, and of the Admiralty then changing the Hermione's name to Retribution, and in the service, people having started to call the Surprise the Nemesis in the meantime. And as he's telling this story, he stops as he's heard that there's a launch and 2 canoes putting off from the shore. So off goes Stanhope with Jack to see Dr. Maturin. For the first moment here, we get Dr. Maturin being called out in good terms. Dr. Maturin is valuable, they say to each other, and ingenious. Well, we'll find out more about valuable and ingenious Maturin in a second. But Mike, Nemesis, is there something that we can look into behind the name there and the name of the ship?
Thanks. Yeah, Nemesis. Well, Anthony Gary Brown in the Patrick O'Brien Muster book says that this historical incident is as described, actually happened. And the connection Jack was about to point out was that Hermione renamed Retribution. Nemesis was the goddess of retribution in Greek legend. So, a connection between these two names. That's why people called the surprise Nemesis here.
Yeah.
Well, up on deck, Jack is looking at this valuable and ingenious man, per the envoy, Stephen Maturin, and he thinks, well, he may be that, but he's also false. He's clearly holding a vampire on his chest. Now, the boat and the canoes pull up, and Jack's looking at all these new stores, and he tells Stephen he's very glad the trip was successful, but still, no vampires can be allowed on board. Stephen smiles and tells him, this is a 3-toed sloth. And I'm thinking, not only is Stephen delighted to have his little sloth there, but he's delighted to be able to tell Jack, I'm thinking in Stephen's mind, I get so upset with all these nautical terms, but I'm going to tease you with one of my natural terms here. And he says, furthermore, the most affectionate, discriminating sloth you can imagine. So having just heard this characterization of the animal turns, fixes his eyes on Jack, utters a despairing wail, and buries his face in Stephen's shoulder. So, oh my gosh, I think Jack might have quite the reaction to this. We should probably let him grab a glass of Madeira while we do the same. Amen. And we'll be right back.
I'm going to go and bury my face in someone's shoulder. Be right back after the break. Well, that was a great moment to take a break just after we'd introduced the sloth. And we start the second half of the show with more on the sloth and his life aboard the Surprise. It seems to take immediately to life at sea. It sleeps hanging upside down from a hawser. It loves exploring the rigging with the hands, who have all now been well fed on fresh greens and are feeling pretty good. They claim that it's the sloth that's bringing them good luck. And once again, we get a little pointer towards the superstition of the foredeck hands. One thing that does disturb the sloth amidst all this kind of bucolic friendliness is pistol practice by Stephen. I think also musket practice by the Marines, but in particular, pistol practice by Stephen. And Mike, there's a little ominous note there. We haven't heard of Stephen using pistols for any reason other than the duel back in Post-Captain. So we start to ask ourselves, I wonder why Stephen Maturin is practicing his pistol shot.
Well, the wind is now favoring them, and even the Surprise seems to be getting better along with Stephen. O'Brien tells us she's behaving like the old Surprise of Jack Aubrey's youth. And now, acting Lieutenant Babbington is overseeing midshipman Braithwaite, the guy who actually stole the rats, measurement of her speed. So I think Babbington holds a little bit of resentment about having been kind of, in his mind, hooked into the rat plot here. And Braithwaite is hollering, we're doing, 11 knots. And Babbington double checks that. And then you can see Babbington turn from lieutenant back into a kid again. Ain't it prime, sir? Ain't it prime? I love that. Well, Stephen, in the meantime, wins a bottle of IPA from the parson over a bet that he could read a random book passage by the light of the ocean's phosphorescence only. And he takes his bottle of IPA, his winning, and he invites Jack to share it with him and Lethargy. And I thought, what perfect name for a sloth.
That's correct.
I just like Lethargy here. But fascinatingly, as we're in the world of O'Brien, any passage at random is pretty usually not a passage at random. So, when Stephen opened this book, he read these two lines: "The virgin's wish without her fears impart, excuse the blush and pour out all the heart, speed the soft intercourse from soul to soul, and waft a sigh from Indus to the pole." And I thought, okay, that's kind of just out there. And we immediately kind of get sucked away because Stephen's saying, "I win, I want my bottle." But, we, of course, had to go back and found out some pretty interesting history here.
Right. This book, well, this book passage that Stephen reads is, in fact, a set of lines from a poem by Alexander Pope called Eloisa to Abelard. Now, Abelard and Eloise were famous lovers in a few different works of literature, but here we've got this poem of lines written from one to the other. This love affair took place between an 18-year-old student and her teacher, the renowned French scholar and philosopher and poet Peter Abelard, 20 years her senior. So we've got a little forerunner here of the story of Lolita that came many centuries later. The poem is a letter from her, the 18-year-old girl, to him, the scholar and poet, now that she is a nun. And he, who had been castrated by her uncle for impregnating her, is also in holy orders. So it's a poem looking back on a love affair rather than kind of looking at one in the present. Even years later, she still longs for him, even though they're separated and they can no longer physically be lovers together. She can't, she says, love God like the other nuns do, since she still loves him and is heartbroken over it. And Pope in this poem might be showing her inability to make a commitment to the path of romantic love, or she might be showing repentance and piety. It turns out that she hadn't wanted to marry Abelard because she thought marriage was the death of love. And now, I think, Mike, we start to get into some of the ideas that O'Brien is leaving in the background here for us to pick up on. And Pope had been inspired by a translation of this story from the French by his friend John Hughes. And that's the set of lines that we quoted from. There are some really nice other lines here. Thou knowest how guiltless first I met thy flame when love approached me under friendship's name. How much does Stephen value friendship first? And has he sort of sought and even offered to be merely Diana's friend? It's a very, very beautiful poem. It's worth digging into it. There's going to be other references that we pick up on in the chapter later on as well. But Mike, I think you did an awesome job digging out this reference.
Well, it was fascinating to me. I agree with you. And it's almost like there's a little bit in this where she is kind of saying heaven and angels really kind of don't hold sway for me as much anymore because I've had you. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my, it's almost like a gender reversal. Stephen, who is a very faith-filled man, becomes, and I think we'll see this as the chapter plays out, how his faith and his loving and pining and longing for Diana kind of run afoul of each other a little bit, or how he thinks of her differently than he might the rest of the world, So, fascinating. And O'Brien, oh my gosh, the way you do this just always knocks me out here.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
Well, we've got another star-crossed lover here, not just perhaps Stephen and Diana, but also Jack and the sloth. And Jack tells Stephen, I can't imagine what this sloth has against me. I've been nothing but civil to it. And I don't understand why you call him discriminating. So Jack's got his feelings doubly hurt here. It's this, the sloth doesn't like me. And you're saying the sloth is discriminating. What does that say about me? And O'Brien writes, Jack was of a sanguine temperament. He liked most people, and he was surprised when they did not like him. This readiness to be pleased had been damaged of recent years, but it remained intact as far as horses, dogs, and sloths were concerned. It wounded him to see tears come into the creature's eyes when he walked into the cabin, and he laid himself out to be agreeable. So he's thinking, all right, I'm going to win this guy over. I'm just going to do it.
Well, an opportunity comes as the weather gets a bit chillier. They're running south now, and the sloth, rather than playing in the rigging, is spending more of its time below in a temperature that feels more like a tropical rainforest. Stephen, meanwhile, is up in the tops teaching Bondon to write. And Mike, we remember in the previous chapter or the chapter before, Bondon had been caught out, not able to take dictation from Stephen, which was a very touching moment. So here we have Stephen on the pathway towards helping Bondon achieve literacy. Simultaneously, Stephen's looking out for his first albatross as they head south. Now, Jack, back in the cabin, sees the anxious, concerned sloth looking up at him, offers the sloth a piece of cake dipped in grog. Here's the key moment. The sloth takes the cake. Minutes later, the sloth climbs down, walks over to Jack silently, and stands there looking up at Jack, eyes bright with expectation, it says in the text. More cake, more grog, growing confidence and esteem.
Oh,
This is what friendship's all about. Spiking your buddy's snacks with alcohol. Very good. After that, the sloth's got a habit that's getting very firmly ensconced here. Comes to visit Jack every day whenever the drum beats the retreat. Has his very own bowl of grog and sometimes falls asleep holding the empty bowl. And Mike, which of us hasn't fallen asleep holding the empty bowl? Huh?
I was thinking this is my college years in a nutshell. Oh.
So this continues until one day Stephen comes into the cabin and finds the sloth curled on Jack's knee, breathing heavily. Stephen shakes the sloth, hangs it on its rope. It grabs on, and there's this moment of visual comedy that you can just see in your mind's eye. You know, there would be a sort of wah 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 soundtrack in the music in the movie at this point. It grabs onto the rope, holds with one hand and one foot, letting the others dangle. And here's Stephen's reaction in the text. Stephen looked sharply round, saw the decanter, smelt the sloth, and cried, here come the immortal words, ladies and gentlemen, and cried, Jack, you have debauched my sloth. And Mike, I think we should just pause for a minute for this famous phrase just to sink in. Good. Jack, you have debauched my sloth. On the other side of the cabin bulkheads, it's not comedy time though. Atkins of the envoy suite is sitting there listening, tells the envoy, high words are passing between the captain and the doctor. And Atkins, who's a bit of a curmudgeon, wonders whether the captain can really stomach the doctor giving all of this insolent language out. The captain, who's supposed to be a man of spirit, Atkins would give the doctor a thrashing directly.
Ooh.
And Mr. Stanhope deprecates this a bit, doesn't really believe in listening behind bulkheads, but they all can't help hearing when Stephen starts using French phrases. And this all is going on as Killick walks in wooden-faced. And I'll do my best with Stephen's French phrases here. Moi crapuleuse, which means your sordid morals or habits. Tu cherches à corrompre mon paresseux. You're trying to corrupt my sloth. Va donc, salope. Come on then, you bastard. Espèce de fripouille. You silly cad. Which is... I can't imagine anybody these days saying that in anger, but that's kind of a translation, I think, of what this is meant to say. I don't know whether Stanhope can understand the French or whether he just gets the tone, but clearly Stephen is dishing it out. And Stanhope says, oh, I hope they won't be late for the whist game. So are they then on time for the whist game?
They are on time for the whist game, and they walk in, both of their faces red. And everybody noticed that Stephen cheats to have the envoy as his partner, not Jack as usual. And Stephen wins hand after hand. And after each one, he schools Jack and Atkins with postmortems on their bad play. And the evening ends with the tension just as high as it began as they settle this monstrous score. Who owes whom what here? And Jack says with an artificial cheerfulness that if the master's reckoning is as accurate as the doctor's deadly leads, well, and the wind holds, we'll all wake up in Rio tomorrow. We're making progress on the journey. But boy, Stephen shooting pistols, tension's pretty high here. Atkins wondering why Stephen isn't calling Jack out.
Right. And the last person that Stephen fleeced at cards was
Yes.
the overprivileged Marine officer who was saying saucy things about Diana. This is, you know, there's potential for all kinds of things to go wrong here. So Stephen's not in a great mood, and he's still in a grouchy mood the next morning, even grouchier than usual since the sloth has been sick overnight in his cabin. But maybe we think the arrival of mail from the shore will cheer him up, and it certainly cheers up Jack, who goes on gushing about the letters that he's got from Sophie. The beautiful handwriting, he says. This piece about the garden and the pears at Melbury. As good, he says, as good as anything in all literature. Which, we kind of doubt, but that's okay, Jack. You carry on thinking that. We also get a bit of a reminder of the tragedy of the story of Lieutenant Nichols, because as he had feared, no letters came for him from his wife. There is, however, more good news for Jack. There's a letter coming from his prize agent saying that this Admiralty payment that we started talking about, back at the beginning of the book, has finally come through. He's more or less out of debt. Now, if he can just look out for a prize or two, he can seal the deal with Mother Williams. And this is clearly making Jack very happy, to the extent that Stephen reflects that he can see the old piratical gleam in Jack's eyes. And Jack himself, to Stephen, looks 5 years younger.
Well, Jack's feeling very generous now. So he offers Stephen the chance to do some botanizing on shore while all this work takes place on the Surprise. And Stephen, grabs the opportunity. Oh, Jack, how truly good of you. I had to put violence upon myself to come away from Cape St. Roch to abandon that vegetable magnificence. The Brazilian forest is a haunt of the tapir, the boa, the peccary. You may find it hard to credit, Jack, but never yet have I beheld a boa. And just like that, all is well with the world again. No pistols, no dueling. As you say, it's so great that Jack doesn't even have to mention vampire sloth or Stephen's grouchy mood. He just sets this all right.
The power of friendship. The power of friendship. It's really great. So, time passes. Stephen goes ashore while work takes place on the Surprise, and he returns. He's seen a boa. He's seen many other wonderful things ashore, and now he sees the Surprise ready for action. She has this new taller rig, she has new paintwork, and she has a captain who's fired up with new ambition, who sees the opportunity to chase Admiral Linois. That's the admiral who had, back in Master and Commander, captured Jack and Stephen and the Sophie, and it's Linois who has passed into the Indian Ocean with 2 frigates and a corvette in his squadron, and these seem like tasty potential prizes for Jack. So there we go, Mike. Not for the first time and not for the last. We get a little reminder that Linois is somewhere up ahead. And for Jack, that means the prospect of potential prizes and glory and distinction. For Stephen, well, Stephen's not sure, right?
Yeah. Stephen, he's remembering Linois on a 74. He's got a fleet with him. And Stephen asks Jack if they're in any immediate danger. And Jack says, no. They're tens of thousands of miles away, but there's not a moment to lose. He needs to get the crew trained up like the Livelies, and says he so longs to be married. He says Stephen has no idea how the idea of being married drives a man. And then he apologizes. I think he catches himself up short thinking about Stephen and Diana. He apologizes if he's spoken awkward. So Stephen replies, and I love this, "Why, my dear, I am no great friend to marriage, as you know, and sometimes I wonder whether you may not have set too great a store on a contract compelling you to be happy, whether any arrival can amount to the sum of voyages, whether in fact it would not be better to travel indefinitely." And I'm thinking, I love this. I love, O'Brien's thoughts on marriage as always spoken through Stephen. And I'm wondering a little bit, too, if Stephen doesn't have a little bit of insight here. Jack's, all revved up, thinks this deal is sealed. Perhaps Stephen knows more.
He does. This is going to be one of these moments when Stephen can bring perspective to Jack. And as we're thinking about this, we get to reflect on letters to Stephen from Sophie. Now, Sophie's been writing romantic, betrothed lover type letters to Jack. She's been writing honest friend type letters to Stephen. And the report that we get is that Mrs. Williams is getting worse in all kinds of ways. Her mind, though, has gathered fresh energy, which is a terrifying prospect. She's been battering Sophie with the prospect of this Reverend Hinksey, the parson that Mrs. Williams had first wanted Sophie to marry, wants her to give up this Captain Aubrey who's going to India after that woman. If only Mrs. Williams knew which of these two men was actually going after Diana. Anyway, she says, Sophie, let me die in peace. Get married to a man that all your friends approve of, a man with handsome private means who could look after you and your sisters when your mother is gone. Talk about the guilt trip.
Right.
Captain Aubrey, in Mrs. Williams' assessment here, was probably already in the arms of some trollop. His precious Lord Nelson says every man is a bachelor once they're beyond Gibraltar. She's not wrong. Nelson did say that. Admiral Haddock says sea water and distance wash love away, and I'm sure Haddock's not the first person to have said that either. She hopes that Sophie will honour this request for her sister's sake, even if her mother's happiness means nothing to her. Oh, not for the first and last time. I think to myself, Mrs. Williams is a terrible person.
Absolutely.
And mind you, this sort of tone of skepticism about people when they're far apart is one that Stephen can relate to a bit. And here's a quote of Stephen's perspective. Stephen loved and esteemed Sophie more than any woman he knew, but he expected heroic virtue in no one. Not heroic virtue of long duration, with few allies, and they 10,000 miles away. 10,000 miles, and how many? Weeks, months, even years? Time meant one thing in an active, ever-changing life, quite another in a remote provincial house, cooped up with a strong woman, devoid of scruple, convinced of her divine rectitude. he's got Mrs. Williams to a T here. Stephen knows Mrs. Williams, and he reflects that he understands what her priorities are. Mrs. Williams and people like her, he says, worshipped capital with an unshakable, uncomprehending, steady devotion, not devoid of superstitious practices. So it's not only sailors who have superstitions. This, he thinks, gives her arguments strength far beyond their ordinary reach. So Mrs. Williams is credibly making this request from the real depths of her, her emotional knowledge about the world. Stephen had thought about all of this going through the jungle, and he thinks about it now as Jack's expression turns from embarrassment to a hint of puzzled anxiety as he detects some of the motive behind Stephen's words. So,
yeah, I think, like you say, Jack's thinking, oh, this is just Stephen thinking about marriage because of what's happened to him. Whoa, right. wait. Maybe Stephen knows something here. He so often does. Wow.
It's funny. I'm not sure whether we ever find out that Jack really knows how much Sophie discusses of things with Stephen. And I don't think it matters terribly. I don't think it's a story of sort of, things being held from Jack. But I don't know if he ever realizes just how much Sophie leans on Stephen as the big brother, and he vice versa.
Yeah, I don't know. You're right. I don't know if he's got that much insight. I think he does know that Stephen somehow magically got her and her sister aboard so that they could have their understanding, that somehow Stephen kept telling him, and then somehow Stephen made this happen. But I bet you're right. Jack is not that deep old file in emotional kind of terms.
No, you're right. It's not his style to have in-depth thoughts about why people do the things that they do.
Right. Oh, that's great. Well, a message comes in that Mr. Stanhope's launch is putting off, and Jack is so happy. He thinks, oh, he's coming back now. I'm not going to miss the tide. And we learn that the surprises, we call them, they're no longer raccoons and surprises and landsmen. They've all come together. They had some battles with other crews ashore. They'd fought as one, all wearing surprise ribbons, in their hats. And they now move together with diligent purpose, we hear, preparing the ship to sail and to receive the envoy. So it's starting to sound a little bit more like the Livelies here.
Yeah.
And Stephen sees the envoy. He sees that the time on land has certainly restored his spirits, but probably hasn't done much for his health, and sadly has taken away his sea legs. And they start to have a discussion about what they've heard in the post, what their orders are. And very quickly, as the surprise gets underway and starts rocking, the envoy excuses himself, wondering aloud how long this seasickness is going to afflict him here.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's not looking good. And Stephen, kind of tables the business discussion, gets him back to lie down, and stays with him to comfort him until he finally has to just turn him over to his valet holding a bucket. So we're not going to be able to comfort you anymore. But Stephen, parting, tells Mr. Stanhope he'll likely grow accustomed to the motion much quicker this time. And I think this is Stephen administering a placebo, because in Stephen's mind, he knows that once we reach the high southern latitudes, from everything I've heard, this is nothing compared to what you're about to see.
Indeed. So the surprise does indeed make quick progress down the Atlantic through the trade winds. And Jack is starting to think aloud with Stephen about how he's going to handle the ship through the weather that's coming. He says she must be handled like a thoroughbred mare, a light, careful hand to keep her from being pooped. And he says if they were pooped or broached to, Jack wouldn't like to answer for the foremast yard or the foremast itself. So these are all parts of the rig that have been refitted but not completely satisfactorily following the squall. The foremast, says Jack, is the only thing I can't replace, which is a great little extra ratcheting up of the jeopardy for Jack and the crew of the Surprise as we get into the Roaring Forties, or at least headed in that direction. Stephen shakes his head. He looks grave and pauses before asking when he might be able to reasonably hope to see an albatross. And he's like, he doesn't want to engage with all this thought of jeopardy and foremasts and weather. What he really wants is to just calm himself a little bit by thinking about nature. So when can I get to see an albatross? Never mind, says Jack. I'll order the crew to let you know as soon as one gets sighted.
Well, Jack puts that order out, and as soon as they start to get a little further south and the temperature drops, Stephen is constantly called on deck. Oh, come see your bird, come see your bird. But it's never an albatross. And they sail for weeks, the Surprise settling into this daily routine. And I'm not sure how many times we hear this in the canon, or how many times we've heard it up until now. But I love this, the way O'Brien describes the routine. A routine, he says, that obliterated time. So, in O'Brien's writing, that it seemed normal to all hands that they should travel endlessly over this infinite and wholly empty sea, watching the sun diminish and the moon increase. And we learned that Bondon's writing lessons have been going on this whole time.
Right. And this is a great thing. We started off this story with Bondon being shown up to be illiterate a couple of chapters ago, and now he's becoming a bit of a scholar. Bondon's neat writing has graduated from a slate to pen and ink, and he's sitting there with Stephen in the mizentop. He's smiling as he tries to transcribe the verse that Stephen recites. Then we upon our globe's last verge shall go, and view the ocean leaning on the sky. From thence our rolling neighbours we shall know, and on the lunar world securely pry. By God, I believe I see the albatross. And Bondon is kind of writing this down. He just transcribes, I believe I see the albatross, said Bondon's lips silently. It don't rhyme. Another line, sir, maybe. So Stephen is probably not making this up. He's reciting from memory something that he knows by heart for good reason, right? What do we think the origin of this poetry might be?
Well, this is definitely John Dryden, one of the canon's favorite poets. We hear time and time again. And we're going to hear from this same poem again later. So maybe we can come back to this one in a bit, or I can't remember. I think it's in the next half of this chapter. But Don't forget it.
There we
Good.
go. Well, Bonden confirms that what they can see far off is indeed the albatross, and he starts to fill Stephen in on what he knows as a naval man about the bird. He says they taste fishy if you don't skin them. Some people say they bring ill winds, and of course, they are the best way to make an albatross pie. And I'm thinking, yeah, it would be kind of difficult to make albatross pie without the actual albatross. But by this time, what started as a remote fleck far, far from the ship is now an enormous presence. It's 13 feet across with black-tipped wings. It shoots past them, vanishes among the sails, and reappears 50 yards behind them. The entire ship now starts yelling and calling out, notifying Stephen, there's the albatross, because the captain had told them all, tell Stephen when you see an albatross, and Stephen is right there, face to face with the albatross. And this is a really lovely moment for Stephen. With great patience as well and forbearance from Bonden, Stephen just gets to sit in the top there for hours on end watching the albatross.
Yeah. Well, the next days, O'Brien tells us, are the most trying that Stephen has spent at sea. He watches all these former South Sea whalers fishing for albatross. They're capturing him. And Stephen watches these beautiful, amazing, enormous birds come flying in. And the text says, be converted into tobacco pouches, pipe stems, hot dinners, down comforters to be worn next to the skin, and charms against drowning. No albatross ever drowned. As many as half a dozen were following the ship now, and not one of them was ever seen to drown. Blow rough, blow smooth. So Stephen knows, I can't really say anything about it because I bought the first two and skinned them myself. So he turns to Jack and says, Jack, can you order the men not to get the albatrosses?
Stephen's caught between him participating in the family life and the superstitions of the Navy here and his desire as a natural philosopher. Jack knows there's a limit to what Stephen can ask for, though. He does agree to give the order, but he tells Stephen it's against the custom. That word again. The older hands won't like it. They'll be mad at you, the doctor, and half of them will use this as an excuse to start prophesying woe, to start saying that we'll run into a widowmaker of a blow or we'll hit a mountain of ice. And Stephen says, well, that's not much of a prophecy from what I've read and heard from Pullings. He the foreteller of bad weather. All these things are likely occurrences in 40 degrees south. And just for once, Jack doesn't want to talk about the weather. Come, said Jack, reaching for his fiddle. Let us play Boccherini through before we turn in. We may not have another chance this side of the Cape with your upsetting the natural order of things.
Whoa.
Wow. And Mike, there is where we're going to stick a bookmark in this chapter of HMS Surprise and come back for the second half next week. End of part 1. So it's great. We've had this transformation for Stephen from kind of crippled to almost newly formed hero. It seems to be about complete. Even in that last paragraph that we got to there, his hands are strong enough to attempt playing Boccherini, which is great, right? It looked like he might not even ever play again.
It's amazing.
The only physical skill that he still seems to be working on is pistol shooting. Still practicing that. Makes you wonder, do we think he's going to need his pistol skills anytime soon?
Right. Well, we've had the sloth, the sloth, right. This poster child for Patrick O'Brien internet fandom. Yeah. I'm wondering, okay, so, that was great. Do we see it again? Do we see it again? And it's funny, Ian, I think we've been so sensitized to say, anytime there's a close animal reference, it means something. And I think I've always just so delighted in the sloth. I didn't think about what could this mean, but you've thought about it.
Right. And I really thought about it at the moment when I was reading the part in the chapter about how Stephen was grouchy because he'd stayed up all night with the vomiting sloth in his cabin. I'm thinking, that sounds like parenthood. And it's funny because in this chapter, Stephen has been looking after the sloth. Actually, Jack has also begun in his own dysfunctional way to look after the sloth. And in parallel, we've had Jack and Stephen both playing their part in looking after the midshipmen. So these relationships between Jack and Stephen on the one hand and the sloth and the midshipmen on the other hand are kind of little proto parent-child relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a kind of relationship that we haven't spoken about much so far in the canon. And I don't think it's giving too many spoilers away to say that that's something that's going to be a big part of the second half of this novel and a big part of lots of the writing. One of the big themes that O'Brien talks about. We have a Crossing the Line episode about Patrick O'Brien writing about relationships between adults and children. And it goes miles deep if you want to look hard for it.
Yeah. Miles
So,
deep and throughout the canon.
yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
exactly.
And speaking about those relationships with children, in case we missed it, the reference to Babbington and his fondness for the ladies in earlier books, go all the way
Yeah.
back to Master and Commander, and they're kind of trying to fend off the older women and young Babbington, who almost seems like a child back then, and then we remember him and Diana and the bean-fed horse.
Yeah.
Babbington, say, I'll just have a go at this Miss Diana. So Jack does a very nice job of reminding us here in this chapter, and I just it's funny. I feel like I've grown up with Babbington and Pullings, and it's so fascinating to be back here as they're first being introduced, because I think I
Yeah.
know so much about them, but you go to Singularity and sort of look up, going, what do we really know about them, and how masterfully, in just small little dabs of paint, O'Brien started to flesh them out here.
That's great. He's doing the same for Bondon as well. Bondon has having been around to succor Stephen and Jack a little bit through the trials of the Stephen's capture and escape, and now benefiting from his relationship to Stephen and being his own step into another version of adulthood, him gaining literacy. And I think it's great. I love that for Bondon, and I think it's a wonderful thing for Stephen and his friendship with him. We also have albatrosses, right? I mean, the albatross thing has been kind of pretty much laid out in front of us here, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think any of us have to be experts on the rhyme of the ancient mariners to say albatross, absolutely a symbol for something here. And, as the crew reminded Stephen, it's a creature of the open ocean and the stormy southern latitudes, which gives us an idea about where the surprise could be heading. Oh, the woe and prophecy.
So we're headed for Bombay. We're not sure whether we're going to touch shore again. Between here and Bombay, we've got the southern latitudes. We've got more albatrosses and maybe even ice. We've got Stanhope and Atkins. We've got Stephen and Jack. We've got the sloth. And we've got the albatross, Mike. We've got all the ingredients for more great turns and twists in the story here. What do you say then next week to just a little bit more of this Patrick O'Brien?
With all my heart.
Jack, you have debauched my sloth.